Today, we're diving deep into the foundational principles of applied behavior analysis, or ABA, breaking down the core concepts that define this field. It's a discipline often talked about, but not always fully understood. So we're going to explore what makes ABA a distinct scientific approach to understanding and changing behavior.
That's right, Noah. When we talk about the foundations of ABA, we're really starting with its historical context and a very practical definition. An excellent example of ABA in action is when a BCBA, a board-certified behavior analyst, teaches a child to request a break instead of resorting to aggression.
So with that example, what are the key elements that make it ABA? Because teaching a child can mean many things in different contexts. I see here in the notes that the example breaks down the observable behavior, the environmental variable, and the social significance.
Precisely. In that scenario, we identify an observable behavior, which is the aggression or alternatively requesting a break. We also look at the environmental variable, such as the teacher removing a task after the child makes that request. And crucially, it has social significance, because it reduces aggression and increases effective communication. We are measuring behavior, changing the environment, and improving a socially important behavior.
That makes sense. It's about seeing what's happening, making a change, and ensuring that change has a meaningful impact. Building on that, ABA is rooted in a scientific approach. Can you walk us through the levels of science it employs?
Absolutely. It starts with description. You're just observing and collecting data. For example, a child hits 8 times during math class, but 0 times during art class. You're simply describing the behavior you see.
So no interpretation yet, just facts. What's the next step?
The next step is prediction. Building on that description, you might notice a pattern. Every time math starts, hitting increases. From this, you can predict, quote, if math starts, hitting likely occurs, end quote. But at this stage, you haven't intervened or changed anything.
And the ultimate goal, I imagine, is control?
Yes. Control is where you actively manipulate a variable to change behavior. Staying with our example, you teach break requests during math. Now, when math starts, the child requests a break and hitting stops. You've manipulated the independent variable, teaching the request, and the behavior, the dependent variable of hitting, changed. That's control.
That's a clear progression. It's not just about what ABA does, but also the mindset. What are the core scientific attitudes that underpin this work?
A fundamental attitude is determinism. If a student screams during work, you assume, quote, there's a reason this is happening, end quote. You don't dismiss it as them just being difficult. Then there's empiricism, which means relying on objective observation and measurement. Instead of saying, quote, he's always screaming, end quote, you collect data, 3 screams Monday, 1 scream Tuesday, 0 screams Wednesday. You're using measurement.
So moving from assumptions to concrete data. And how does experimentation fit in?
Experimentation follows naturally. You might test an intervention. You observe a baseline where screaming continues, then you add a break card and screaming decreases. You've manipulated a variable, which is an experiment. Replication is also key. If the intervention works in math class, then in reading class, and then at home, you're seeing the same effect across settings, which suggests the intervention is robust.
And what about parsimony? That sounds like a principle of simplicity.
It is. Before attributing behavior to a complex explanation, like saying, quote, they have anxiety, end quote, you check simpler explanations first. For instance, you might consider if the task is too hard, which could be causing the behavior. You test the difficulty level, and if behavior decreases, you've ruled out the more complex explanation first. Finally, there's philosophic doubt, always questioning. Even if an intervention works, you continue collecting data and ask, quote, could something else explain it, end quote. It's about ongoing skepticism and inquiry.
That commitment to questioning is powerful. Let's shift to the behavioral philosophy that guides ABA. What's the distinction between behaviorism and mentalism? And what is radical behaviorism?
Behaviorism posits that the environment explains behavior. If a student talks out, a mentalistic explanation might be, quote, they want attention because they're impulsive, end quote. A behavioristic explanation, however, is that talking out leads to the teacher giving attention, and that attention reinforces the behavior. Mentalism, which ABA generally avoids, attributes behavior to internal, unobservable states like he hits because he's angry. A behavior analytic explanation would look at what happens immediately after the hitting. For example, he hits, work is removed, leading to escape reinforcement.
And radical behaviorism then expands on that, correct? It acknowledges private events, right?
Yes, radical behaviorism includes private events. If a child says, quote, I don't want to do it, I'm scared, end quote, radical behaviorism acknowledges that thoughts and feelings exist, that they are behaviors, and that they are influenced by the environment. Perhaps the teacher previously gave the child escape when they said, I'm scared. So even that private event is shaped by the environment. Then there's pragmatism, which simply means using what works. If a token board doesn't work, but a break card does, ABA advocates using the break card. It's not about what sounds best, but what is effective.
It sounds like a very results-oriented approach. Beyond these philosophical underpinnings, what are the different domains within behavior analytic science itself?
There are 4 main domains. First, experimental analysis of behavior, or EAB. This is the basic science, often laboratory-based, like studying rats pressing a lever for food to understand reinforcement schedules. This produces basic principles. Then, applied behavior analysis, which is where those principles are applied to real life. For example, a BCBA using reinforcement schedules to have a student earn a token after 5 tasks. Professional practice is the direct application of ABA, where a BCBA conducts functional behavior assessments, writes behavior intervention plans, trains staff, and monitors data. Finally, translational research bridges the gap. Researchers might notice students don't respond to reinforcement schedules exactly like lab animals, so they study how reinforcement works in a classroom to connect basic lab findings to applied settings.
So we have the pure science, the application, the direct service, and the research that connects them. That makes sense. Now, ABA is defined by 7 core dimensions. What are these characteristics that make something truly applied behavior analysis?
These are critical. It must be applied, meaning it addresses socially important behaviors, like teaching a child to request help instead of crying. Not applied would be teaching a child to stack blocks for no reason. It's behavioral, meaning the focus is on measurable behavior, like the number of requests or the duration of a tantrum, not subjective statements like, quote, he's doing better, end quote. It's analytic, meaning you demonstrate a functional relation. If tantrums are 10 per day at baseline and after teaching a request they drop to 1 per day, you've shown the intervention caused the change.
And the others, I believe technological and conceptually systematic are next, and then effective and generality.
It's technological, meaning the intervention is clearly written so anyone can replicate it. For example, step-by-step instructions like, quote, present task, prompt break, please, honor request, provide 30-second break, end quote. It's conceptually systematic, meaning it's based on established principles like functional communication training, not just a random strategy. It has to be effective, showing a significant change. If tantrums drop from 10 to 9 per day, that's not effective. 10 to 0 per day is. And finally, it needs generality. The behavior should generalize across settings, people, and time. The child requests at school, at home, with a new teacher, and weeks later.
That's a very comprehensive set of criteria. Thinking about the broader impact, what are the societal values that ABA aims to uphold?
First, it's accountable. Teachers collect data daily, and if behavior increases, the plan is changed. It's public, meaning parents and others can understand the intervention without jargon, like, quote, when he asks nicely, give a break, end quote. It's doable. Teachers can implement it during class because it's not overly complicated. It's empowering because teachers learn, quote, I can change behavior by changing the environment, end quote. And finally, it's optimistic. A student previously labeled nonverbal after ABA might use a communication device, demonstrating that behavior change is always possible.
Eloise, you've laid out a lot of information.
To bring it all together, can you give us one big real-life example that demonstrates how all these principles and dimensions work in practice?
Certainly. Imagine a student who screams during math and throws materials. A BCBA first collects data, which is empiricism. They notice a pattern, perhaps screaming increases during difficult tasks, which is prediction. They then teach the student to request a break, which is control. They use reinforcement when the student requests appropriately, applying an ABA principle. The BCBA writes clear step-by-step instructions for the intervention, making it technological. They measure the reduction in screaming and throwing, making it behavioral. When the behavior significantly decreases, it's effective. And if the strategy also works at home, that shows generality. This single example weaves together so many of the foundational elements we've discussed.
That really clarifies how integrated all these concepts are. It's a systematic approach from initial observation to sustained, meaningful change. Eloise, thank you for guiding us through these essential aspects of applied behavior analysis.
My pleasure, Noah.
If you found this discussion helpful in understanding the foundations of ABA, share this episode with someone who would benefit from these insights.